Hey, welcome to the show. My name is Hunter Christensen, and you are listening to Prompted, the official podcast of the Writing Prompts section on Reddit.com. So on today's episode, we're doing things a little bit differently. Rather than reading stories that writers have written from writing prompts, I have a full-length interview with a real author who is Rebecca Adams Wright. I enjoyed doing interviews and including them in episodes in the past, so I decided to reach out to Rebecca, who has recently published her first book, which is The Thing About Great White Sharks and Other Stories, which is a short story collection. It dips into the realm of science fiction and fantasy in some really cool ways. And it really coincides with the stuff that Writing Prompt subscribers seem to typically enjoy, and it's a style that I think a lot of you could get into. So she's the real deal. I mean, Rebecca's book has been longlisted for the Frank O'Connor Award, which is the most prestigious short story award that someone can be considered for. She has a master's degree in fiction writing and just years of experience. And Rebecca graciously agreed to come on the show so that you guys can benefit from her experiences, her advice, and she just has a lot of great things to say. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. I found it enlightening and inspiring. And if you're looking to get more into the world of writing in any way, whether it's just, a hobby, or you just respond to prompts on Writing Prompts, or you're looking to get into it, in more of a long-term career-wise type of thing, then I think you'll get a lot out of our conversation. It's a little long, so if you're not used to long-form interviews, then keep that in mind, but it is so worth it. There are a lot of gems in our conversation. So with no further ado, here it is, my conversation with Rebecca Adams Wright. Enjoy. So yeah, maybe we can just start off by just asking you, have you always wanted to be an author?
Yeah, I really have. I know that is not everybody's path, but it has been mine. Even when I was a little kid, I actually found some of these recently in a box at my folks' house. I used to make these books. I think a lot of little kids do, where you write your own story, you illustrate it all, and then you bind it, right? And I found a stack of those back at my parents' place that, man, I must have done in the second grade. So
wow, so all the way back then, you knew that you wanted to be an author.
I did, yep.
Yeah. Wow, that's really cool. So can you think of any specific moments or times where you just felt really influenced in that direction?
Yeah, I always knew it was something I wanted to do, but there's definitely one moment that I felt like was really transformative for me in sort of making me feel like maybe I had the chops to do it. And I took a class in high school with a teacher I really liked, really admired, English teacher. And the very first essay we had to write for that English class was about Ethan Frome and, and the dreaded pickle jar and all that. And I wrote this essay and I put a lot of work into it and I turned it in. And when I got it back, there was no grade on it. And I was so worried that I had failed. And so I flipped to the back, and even though there was no grade, this teacher had written, "You are too advanced for this class. I'm going to give you different material to work on. Please come see me."
Wow.
And I remember being completely bowled over. I'd never had an experience like that before, where somebody had really said to me, "You have what it takes to do this in a way, that is at the next level." And so it was just so incredibly encouraging for me that I never forgot it.
Yeah.
It was really an affirmation that I was on the right track.
Yeah, no, that would do it. How would you describe yourself as a student growing up? Were you pretty studious, or was your head always in the clouds?
Oh, a little bit of both. I was always a daydreamer.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't play sports. I was terrible because, somebody would put me in outfield and I
Uh,
would, forget where the ball was and get beamed. But when it came to school, I was incredibly studious.
mm-hmm.
Very much that kid who was, a total perfectionist and tried to get everything right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So during your time growing up, you always wanted to be an author. Who were the authors or the writers that were inspiring you along the way?
They were really pretty eclectic.
Mm-hmm.
When I was a kid, I read a lot of everything. But I remember really being into in my sort of, early teen years, which
Mm-hmm.
for me were just years of voracious reading. I was really into Stephen King.
Mm-hmm.
My really small town, I read like every Stephen King book
Yeah.
that was in our tiny library. So I was really into King, other horror, sort of like that. And also, I read a lot of very different but very elegant, sort of quiet literary fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, another writer that I really admired for years, still do, was the Jewish writer Chaim Patak. So he wrote The Gift of Asher Lev, another very critically acclaimed book called The Promise.
Okay.
And they were these really quiet stories, often of Jewish boys with some kind of gift,
Mm-hmm.
an artistic gift, usually, but who had to sort of come to terms with their religion and their gift. And so,
Mm-hmm.
here I was, like, eating up all this Stephen King and all this, like, wonderful, crazy, well-plotted horror stuff. And
Yeah.
then also these, like, beautiful, very elegant, quiet books about, studious, gifted Jewish boys.
Yeah. So it seems like you've always had this range of interest. Do you feel that you've been drawn to any particular genre, like in particular, or do you feel like you've always had this desire for an eclectic taste?
I'd say I've always been relatively eclectic, although I have definitely focused on different genres at different times.
Mm-hmm.
So like I said, in that early sort of those early teenage years, I was really into things like horror. That was
Mm.
a genre I was really into at the time, horror and thrillers.
Mm.
And then I read a whole lot of literary fiction for years, during college, during my time in graduate school. But really where I've settled as a writer
Mm-hmm.
is in science fiction and fantasy.
Mm.
And so I feel like I have picked up things from all of the genres I have loved
Mm-hmm.
and sort of taken them with me. You know,
Mm-hmm.
everything that resonated has moved with me into the next phase of my life. So even though I really pretty much write science fiction and fantasy now,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I still am using all these other things
Yeah, you're
from,
pulling the bits and pieces. So you get that that was back in high school when you got the note from the teacher saying you're too
yeah.
advanced from this. So where from that point moving into college, where did you decide to go for college at first, and how did you get to that point?
So I ended up going to the University of Michigan,
Mm-hmm.
which was where I wanted to go. It was nice. I grew up in Michigan, so the University of Michigan, it was a great school,
Mm-hmm.
but it was also close to home without being in my backyard.
Mm-hmm.
So it ended up being a really good fit for me.
Mm-hmm.
So that was pretty straightforward. I mean, I applied to
Yeah.
some other schools, but that was really where I wanted to be.
Yeah. Did you grow up with many siblings?
I have one brother.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, he's great guy, 4 years younger than me. Works in computers.
Mm. So did any of your family have the interest in reading and writing, or were you kind of the black
Oh my
sheep in
gosh,
that
the whole
regard?
family.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, we are definitely a very bookish family.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up as the child of two attorneys, so
Mm.
we were constantly like arguing and reading, and I mean, my mom would always joke that at holidays, there was only so much that was going to be spent on gifts,
Mm.
but books were never gifts.
Yeah.
Books were just things that appeared,
Mm.
and so we just lived in a home full of books all the time.
Mm.
A lot of
That,
talking.
yeah.
We were a very talkative, well-read family.
Yeah, it seems like a good environment to, I guess, encourage your writing aspirations.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, so were your parents very supportive when you decided to do your undergrad? What did you do your undergrad in?
So I was an English major.
Okay.
I was an English major, and I actually did what the University of Michigan calls a sub-concentration
Mm-hmm.
in creative writing, which is it's like majoring in creative writing, but you do some of the broader stuff in literature as well.
Mm-hmm.
but the sub concentration allows you to take more writing workshops than you could otherwise.
And then, so what made you decide to want to continue that and do a master's in fiction rather than, say, just go out and start writing?
There were a couple of factors at play. The first one was simply that I had a lot more to learn. I mean, no matter how talented you are, no matter how much skill you have, it's a long learning process. And I knew that I really wanted to do the master's program at the University of Michigan. Now, there was absolutely no guarantee I was going to get into that program, but coming out of college, I had learned so much in undergrad, and I had learned enough to realize how much I had left to learn. I was writing things that were much more compelling and much more coherent than when, I had come to college. But I still really wasn't writing stories that fully functioned as stories. And I was aware of that. I was aware that there was definitely a next level I needed to reach, if I wanted to pursue this professionally. And so I knew pretty early on in college that I was going to want to go on and do a master's program. There are other benefits to a master's program as well. One, you just get a network you don't get in undergrad.
Yeah.
You meet so many other talented writers, you meet talented faculty. Most programs are at least 2 years, which means you're going to have just so much more time to be in the think tank,
Yeah.
and to produce work, and hopefully much better work every year.
Yeah.
And so those were all real pros for me.
So our audience, a lot of them are aspiring writers and people that are either just starting out or who have been writing kind of as a hobby for years and years. And I'm sure many of them have contemplated or are contemplating going to some kind of formal program, such as a degree in writing. What, I guess, would you say are the benefits of going to a formal program, and what is that experience kind of like?
That's a really good question. So I think one of the major benefits of a formal program, well, actually, I think there are two. I think one initially is simply psychological. This is, you get that outside affirmation, right? That there is something in your work that is sparking, even if your work, still has flaws, even if it still has places where you need to grow, things that aren't working yet. Someone has looked at your work and said, this person has something, a
You get that
seed
outward
that can
validation.
grow. So there's that nice psychological boost. But beyond that, and I think a lot more important, is that a formal program gives you a cohort. It gives you a cohort of peers that, if you are fortunate, if they are good peers, which at many programs they're going to be, you're going to keep throughout your writing life. And those professionals will become, some of your best readers. They'll become an incredible network for you to draw on for years. Interaction with the faculty is wonderful too. That can, absolutely change your writing life. You can get incredible instruction. But I know for me, the actual peer group I took away with me was definitely one of the most valuable things from my time in graduate school.
Yeah, I can imagine. And I also would imagine that there's also just that physical pressure of output to actually just write, because there's so many people that want to write but just struggle with either doing it consistently or fading in and out of the habit. So I imagine there's also just the pressure to do things that need to be submitted.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's deadlines, right? There's deadlines that someone else is imposing on you, and like any writer, I both fear and love the deadline as well, because deadlines are how you get things done.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So while we're on the topic, I know that you also did the Clarion Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Workshop. Was that after your master's degree, and how did you come to do that?
It was a couple of years after. And the reason I found out about it, at this time, I wasn't really part of the science fiction fantasy community yet. I was just sort of figuring out in graduate school and after that, hey, the stuff I'm writing is kind of weird. It usually has some kind of science fiction or fantasy genre element to it. What does this mean? Because a lot of my peers, they were incredibly talented, but not a lot of them were writing with that sort of genre element. I was in a slightly more traditional program. And so it took me a couple of years to figure out what I was doing. But in the meantime, I was working with a research group called the Genre Evolution Project at the University of Michigan, which studied pulp science fiction magazines.
Okay.
And so we spent years reading stories, coding them for all these different elements in the story, coming up with theories, and then actually writing essays based on the evidence we found.
Okay.
It was a fascinating group. And there were some other, there were some other writers in there. There were people in other fields. We were just drawn together by this love of old science fiction.
Yeah.
And it was actually the leader of that group, a professor named Eric Rabkin, who mentioned to me at one time the Clarion Workshop. And I had never heard of it. But I went home, I researched it. I said, wow, this could be really the next step for me. This could be the place I go to take what I've learned in grad school and build on it.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what happened. For me, I did Clarion about 2 years after I graduated from U of M with the MFA. And that was the second really transformative professional experience I had.
And what was that like? It's down in San Diego, right? So you had to travel across the country.
Yeah. Yeah, for a long time it was based actually in Michigan. It was at MSU for a lot of years, Michigan State University. When I went, it had only been there about a year, so still relatively new to the space.
Yeah.
But there were, oh my gosh, 18 of us? I think there were 18 of us. And in this intensive 6 weeks, every week you had a different instructor who was a professional writer. And so, you have such close contact with the faculty there.
Yeah.
The instructors are wonderful. And it's just another, like the MFA, it's another chance to really be inside this incredible think tank, writing like crazy with these like-minded people, all of whom come, in Clarion, they came from all over the world, with the same dream, right? And it's just an incredibly encouraging environment. The way Clarion is set up as well, you usually write at least one short story a week. And so, it's also just a very intensive writing and critiquing space. But I found it incredibly valuable. For me, there was very much a sense of finding my tribe.
So from there, now you are a published author, and you have your book, The Thing About Great White Sharks and Other Short Stories. How would you describe your book to someone who knows nothing about it?
Oh my goodness. I would say it is a work of speculative fiction. I would say it's eclectic. It's very much a book taking everything I love about science fiction and fantasy and adding a sort of intense, sometimes quiet, focus on character that I really pulled from my days in the literary world. And so for me, it's very much a marriage between more traditional, realistic literary writing and just the wonderful plots and romps, and incredible characters and things you can get in science fiction and fantasy.
Yeah.
Definitely a dark edge to those stories. And they run the gamut. There's aliens, there's ghosts, there's so many weird animals. Weird animals are a thing in that book for sure. I cannot get enough of weird animals.
Where does that come from for you? Where's the draw to write about with these weird animals?
I find myself writing about animals a lot. Often companion animals, who have some kind of, strange twist to them, usually.
Did you grow up with any pets?
I did. I've always had pets. Dogs, cats, gerbils. Now I have chickens. I keep chickens. So definitely, an animal lover. But I think that there is something really special about human beings' relationship with animals. We have these very intense relationships sometimes, but we don't have the same level of communication we can have with other people. We can be very isolated people and still care deeply for animals. I think that there are ways, especially in narrative, to tease out an otherwise very internal, isolated character through a meaningful relationship with an animal. And that's something I find really compelling.
Yeah, one of the reasons why I was drawn to ask to interview you was because of just the structure of how how your novel is a collection of short stories, which very much is similar to how Writing Prompts works, where essentially people submit a whole bunch of different prompts and then people respond to them in the form of short fiction. And so, what made you decide to publish a collection of short stories rather than go right into, publishing a full-length novel?
Well, a couple of things. One, I had the short stories,
Mm-hmm.
and I didn't have the novel yet. I'm currently working on a novel, but short stories are sort of where I began. I think they're where a lot of writers begin,
Mm-hmm.
especially writers who have, worked in the workshop atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
The workshop atmosphere often works better with short fiction than it
Mm-hmm.
does with a novel, unless it's a very specific, sort of differently structured workshop than your
Yeah.
traditional model. And so I know a lot of other writers who have started with stories. And there's something about the freedom of short stories
Mm-hmm.
that I still find really interesting. Um, a lot of a novel's pleasure, both I think in writing and in reading, is the immersion,
Mm-hmm.
right? Spending a long time getting to know characters, getting to know a setting and a place. And that's a wonderful thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I know that for me, that first book was really about, in many ways, about play.
Mm-hmm.
Even though some of the stories are dark, or deal with some weighty themes, there was so much freedom in
Mm-hmm.
saying, this week I'm going to work on this adventure romp, with stunt flyers,
Mm-hmm.
and this next week I'm going to, write about a bereaved couple raising a tiger.
Mm-hmm.
And there was so much fun in that I felt like, these stories were stacking up, themes were coming out of them that, seemed to fit nicely together.
Mm-hmm.
And, I sort of realized I had a book without maybe even knowing it.
Yeah.
One day I just woke up and said, "Oh my gosh, these are really coming together into a book. I think I could do something with
Mm-hmm.
this."
So, would you be able to tell me a bit about how you came to publish them?
Yeah, so, I had made a couple of small sales just out of college.
Mm-hmm.
And my really big break was, again, and this is why I think it's so important to find, especially when you're a beginning writer, to find like-minded writers to support you and be your cheerleaders and critique with you, and
Mm-hmm.
to give that back to them. Because actually the reason I sort of got my big break was a friend of mine from the MFA program. So she had just published a short story of hers, an excellent story, as a Kindle single.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, "Hey, I love this editor I'm working with. I'd love to put you in touch with her. Do you mind if I send her Sheila?" Sheila was a short story I had at the time, about a robotic
The
dog.
one, yeah, the robotic dog story.
Yep. And I said, "Absolutely, I'd love that." And that editor ended up being very interested in that story, ended up publishing it as part of a new magazine called Day One.
Mm-hmm.
It got, good reception with Day One. I maintained contact with that editor. And once I had the collection of short stories, I had an editor to send it to. And so that was sort of how the book came about for me. I established a relationship with this smaller publication that ended up leading to my book sale.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I was so lucky in so many respects.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's also important to have something ready for luck to hit you.
Mm-hmm.
You
Yeah,
know,
I've heard the saying that luck fortunes the prepared. That there's a lot of people out there that are waiting for some big
Absolutely.
break to happen before they put the work in, but you have to have the work before the moment will
Right.
present
You have to
itself.
be ready for your big
Mm-hmm.
break when it comes,
Mm-hmm.
because often those opportunities have a narrow window.
Mm-hmm.
But if you've got that beautiful thing you've been working on for ages ready, when the lightning bolt strikes, you really can
Mm-hmm.
have immense success with that sometimes.
And now your book has been longlisted for the Frank O'Connor Award, which how does it feel to be nominated for that? And maybe you could explain what the Frank O'Connor Award is.
Yeah, absolutely. The Frank O'Connor Award is it's actually an international award for best book of short stories out in a year. And it's very prestigious. It carries I mean, one of the nice things about it for the winner is it carries a large monetary prize,
Hmm.
actually one of the largest for a collection of short stories in the world.
Hmm.
Um, it was an incredible honor to be longlisted for the Frank O'Connor Award. I was so grateful just to be on the long list.
Hmm.
I mean, I mean, we're talking about every book published,
In the whole
in that
world
year
for the
all over the
year. Yeah.
world is up for that award. That's a collection of short stories. And so, I mean, there were some incredible names on that list, and I was just lucky and thrilled to be there.
Hmm. Yeah, I could imagine. So now that you've published your collection of short stories, and you said that you're working on a novel, and like you said, and I can imagine through a lot of your programs, you did a lot of short fiction. What's that transition like? Now sticking with characters for a long period of time and sticking with the plot versus week to week being able to jump around to different stories.
Right. Gosh, I'm not going to pretend for me it's a little bit difficult.
Mm-hmm.
I am used to the snapshot sort of format of the short story. And I'm finding my way in some ways. I've been writing for a while, but this is a very different process.
Mm-hmm.
The process of settling into a story in this way, in this long form is very difficult. I don't think I could say that I like stories better than novels or novels better than stories.
Mm-hmm.
I'm finding different pleasures in writing the novel than I find in writing stories.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's very different. I've had a few roadblocks and I've had to get past them, and
Mm-hmm.
it is definitely it's a little bit rocky at the start, but now that I'm sort of on a roll, I'm really enjoying it.
Hmm. Well, that's great. And how did you settle on one story to pick? Because now that you have to stick with it for a long period of time, I can imagine that's intimidating, choosing what it is that you're going to be spending the next, at least several months on.
For sure, yeah. Well, that's where the roadblocks come in. I
Hmm.
actually, part of the process for me for, sort of working successfully on the novel has been really realizing the difference between a story that is suitable for a short
Hmm.
and a story that is more suitable for a long form work like a novel.
Hmm.
And so the first couple of novel attempts I made years ago didn't really go anywhere. And in retrospect, now that I'm working on a novel that already feels much more successful in certain ways,
Hmm.
I can see that some of that was because I just didn't have stories that were large enough.
Hmm.
I didn't have characters with dilemmas
Hmm.
that were knotty enough. There wasn't really room for any subplots
Hmm.
or the really intense building of any
Hmm.
secondary characters. They were just too closed. They were too
Hmm.
small and closed.
Now, how is it that you know an idea can be turned into a novel? Because so many of our writers, they are used to working in the short fiction kind of realm, and a lot of them want to
Mhm.
write these bigger, grander stories, but kind of run into that roadblock of, oh, I've kind of done everything I wanted to do, or there's no way to kind of expound upon this. How do you know when there's that idea that you can just keep going with?
Right. Um, it's a really good question. I'm not sure I have the answer. I know two things that have helped me to sort of come to that understanding that yes, this particular idea, is weighty enough, is big enough, is
Hmm.
sprawling enough for a novel. Is one, the stakes.
Hmm.
The stakes in this novel I'm writing are immensely high.
Hmm.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be life and death, but I think that the stakes have to feel life and death
Hmm.
for your character. Often for me, short stories are about sort of often smaller transformative moments.
Hmm.
The sort of hinge point where a character is about to change.
Hmm.
But for a novel, I couldn't really use those small hinge point stories anymore.
Hmm.
I really needed something where I had a character, and this is sort of the second part, I think, of what makes a novel idea a novel idea. I needed a character with an enormous dilemma,
Hmm.
a dilemma that really doesn't have a neat solution.
Yeah, something that can't be solved in 10 pages.
Right, the kind of idea where my character might go through several transformations before, they either come to terms with the dilemma or don't,
Hmm.
right? And we get our happy ending or our bittersweet ending or whatever we're going to have.
Hmm.
Those two things for me are really I'm learning what takes me away from a short story and puts me solidly in the realm of an idea that could be a novel.
So what's your writing process actually like? Do you have a certain period of time during the day that you write, and what do you write on, and what's the nitty-gritty for you?
I definitely have a process. It has changed over time. I used to write pretty much every day. I've always been a writer who tried to write every day
Hmm.
at least. It didn't always happen, but I like to write every day when I can. But for years, that could be before work, it could be after work, it could be when I felt like the inspiration was striking me at 2 o'clock,
Uh-huh.
in the afternoon. Now I'm much more regimented and
Hmm.
much more focused because I have a toddler
Hmm.
and I stay home with her. And so, I've got maybe that half hour before she wakes in the morning,
Hmm.
I've got her nap time, and I've got, after she goes to bed at night, hopefully.
Hmm.
So often these days, I might only have 2 hours in a day to write. And so I am so much more efficient in those 2 hours than I ever
Hmm.
was, before I had a
I
child.
can imagine, because now you have that pressure, almost the same thing you have in college, where you have a week deadline, but instead of a week, you have that half hour kind of mini deadline to get something done. Otherwise,
Right.
nothing gets done. Hmm.
Yeah, and I suspect a lot of other writers are in that same boat, right? Even if you
Hmm.
don't have kids, it's you've got the 9 to 5, or you've got that night shift job, and you've just got to write in that few hours that you have.
Hmm.
And for me, it's just been the process of taking a sort of leisurely, writing day and compressing it,
Hmm.
into the 2 hours between, usually for me, 11 and 1
Hmm.
that I get in the middle of the day,
Have you ever
making that work.
have you ever felt like you've had a moment where you thought like, oh, this is how I, work consistently, or oh, this is kind of the secret to having, lots of output? Was there any moment that clicked that either you weren't doing something or you were doing something that was hindering you?
That's a good question. I think I've had several of those moments
Hmm.
because my process has sort of evolved over time. I definitely have tried new things that haven't worked. There was a while I tried writing everything longhand.
Mm.
And I know writers for whom that works immensely well.
Hmm.
For me, it did not work very well. I've found now I've had a couple of aha moments when I'm like, oh, I brainstorm best longhand.
Mm.
So when I'm writing out with a pen, that's when I feel really free to just write all over the page, draw diagrams to help
Hmm.
me. That's when the ideas kind of fly thick and fast for me.
Hmm.
But when I'm actually drafting prose, I'm much better off sitting down at my computer.
Hmm.
And I had a couple of moments of trying things that didn't work,
Hmm.
right? Like that, doing everything long form to find what did.
Hmm. So you just kind of have to experiment till you find your own rhythm that
That's
works
how it was
best.
for me.
Hmm.
Yeah.
That process of when you just need to have no judgment on your ideas and just kind of get everything out and just get moving, versus when you really need to tighten up your writing and be more judgmental and harsh on being more critical, I guess. Where at what point in the process do you draw the line of, this is just a time for freedom versus this is a time to actually, you know be productive and be more critical on what I'm writing?
For me, that line is absolutely between the first draft and the second.
Mm.
So I think one of the best things you can tell yourself as a writer at any stage, but especially as a beginning writer, is to give yourself the permission to write poorly.
Mm.
Give yourself the permission to write poorly in the first draft.
Hmm.
When I am able to do that 100% successfully, I absolutely come up with some of the best gems in my work. So for me, that's like the brainstorming session.
Hmm.
That is the everything can go on the page. Sentences can be awkward. They don't even necessarily have to make sense. But that's the moment to just get out as much of the story and ideas related to the story as possible.
Hmm.
But the editor in my brain definitely steps into the next draft.
Yeah.
That's when, I try to kill everything that's just there to be clever. That's when I'm reworking the sentences, 7, 8, 10 times,
Hmm.
and that's often the draft, that second draft where I've used my internal editor. That's often the draft I will call the first draft to show to people.
Mm.
That's when my readers get the draft.
Mm-hmm.
They never see that first sort of down draft,
Yeah.
because that, would be somewhat incoherent, and I wouldn't do
Mm-hmm.
that to my friends.
Yeah. What about people that are close to you? When things are in the early stages during a first draft, will you show the people that are closest to you? Or do you just not show anyone until you've put the editing cap on during the second draft?
I know writers who do, and who find that really helpful. For me, nope. Nope. I hide that. That is only for me. That is because that is the only way for me I can give myself the permission to do it. As soon as I say, okay, I'm going to show this just to my best friend, I'm going to show this just to my husband, that's when I can't stop the internal editor from saying, but what will they think of you?
Definitely. That makes sense. Now, during the brainstorming stage, where would you say your ideas come from? Like, do you go throughout your day always searching for inspiration, or do you just, have a time where you sit down and ideas come to you, or what happens during that stage?
I don't really actively look for inspiration, but I do find that a lot of small bits and pieces and articles and all sorts of ephemera from my daily life does make its way into my fiction pretty regularly.
So it's more of a subconscious process, you'd say?
It's a little bit more of a subconscious process for me, yeah. Every once in a while, something will happen, or, I'll read some fascinating fact that I'll say absolutely must go in a story. I have to find something to do with this. I have to build a story around this because it's so compelling. In fact, one of the stories in my collection, I did that very consciously. I went to England in 2008, and while I was there, I took a tour of York Minster, the beautiful church. And one of the things the tour guide happened to mention, like just off the cuff, toward the end of the tour, was that during World War II, York Minster took many of its very famous medieval stained glass pieces out of its windows and sent them to families all over the English countryside to try to protect them from bombing. And I thought that was so incredibly interesting that even though I had no idea what I was going to do with it, I said, absolutely, that must be a story. So every once in a while, I have something like that.
Yeah.
And in fact, that did become a story in my collection. It became a story called Keeper of the Glass. But for the most part, I don't do that so much. Often I just sit down and I just start writing out of nothing. What would happen if? And I go from there.
Very cool. So what has been, over the years, the best piece of advice that you've been given that's helped your writing? Or that you would give and pass along to someone else that's new and perhaps struggling?
Well, I have a couple. A couple that are, on the surface, very simple, but I think are really important, and I come back to again and again. One is Neil Gaiman's very sort of famous quotation when people say, how do I, become a writer? And he says, you write. But it's so simple, but it's not. Because there is nothing harder than sitting down every day to write.
Yeah.
Which is bizarre. You want to be a writer, but writing can be the hardest thing. And so just keeping at it, just remaining determined, working even through the days you don't like your work, you don't trust your work, you want to be anywhere but with your work. That's an incredibly helpful piece of advice, I think. If you can do that, frankly, I think someday you are going to make it. So that's one that I've always kept with me.
Very encouraging.
A second one is one we talked about earlier, which is that just give yourself permission to write poorly. Because I really do think that's just the best way to get the deepest stuff, the biggest conflicts, the stuff that makes you the most vulnerable. All of that is going to come out if you just let yourself be bad. When you never let yourself be bad, you're not doing anything new. You're doing what you're already good at. You're not getting anything fresh out of yourself. And the third is another pretty famous piece of advice that I've kept with me since that day when I was 13, and reading all the Stephen King I could get my hands on, which was kill your darlings.
The classic kill your darlings.
Yeah, for sure. When I was a beginning writer, Man, I spent so much time coming up with clever lines, and all this stuff that I thought made me seem so profound. And in the end, it was always the worst piece of my fiction. That was always the place that a really good professor crossed out with the red pen because it wasn't serving the story, it was just serving my ego.
Yeah.
And I think that's what he means by kill your darlings. Don't kill the stuff that's good, kill the stuff that made you pat yourself on the back a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So, a lot of people who are new to writing don't necessarily have access to a full writing program. And you talked about how it helped you get to the next level. Are there any resources, whether it's, websites or books or anything that you have found helpful or you think would be helpful to someone that's, say at home writing short fiction, but just doesn't know how to kind of break through to the next level?
Oh my gosh, yes. And writing programs are great. I've been there, I've done them, I loved them. If you have access to them, fantastic. But if you don't, there are so many ways to get some of that same experience. And one of them is online. Online writers groups can be an amazing resource, especially for people who don't, for whatever reason, just don't have the ability to travel or to leave their jobs. Finding an online critique group and sharing your work and getting feedback on your work and giving feedback as well. I think another really wonderful way to grow as a writer is to be forced to talk about someone else's writing and what is working in it in a specific way and what is not working in a specific way. And you can absolutely get that. There are so many wonderful online critique groups. A little Googling is going to get you there. And, I have met some incredibly warm and wonderful people online. Another place, there's actually a couple of books that really helped me at different phases of my career that I can talk about real quickly. One is called The 90-Day Novel. I know writers that have used this in the past. I'm actually using it right now. The novel I'm writing right now, I'm actually writing with the help of the book, The 90-Day Novel. It's written by a man named Alan Watt, and it takes you day by day through the process of writing the first draft of a novel. So if, like me, you find it a bit intimidating to sit down with a sort of long form project with no absolute end in sight, this can be a great resource to help you. I'm really liking it so far.
Yeah, I'll definitely have to put a link to that for our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. I've found it useful, and I have friends who have found it useful as well. It may not be for every writer, but it is a nice practical guide.
Yeah, the tool in the toolbox you can reach for when you're struggling.
Another book that I really liked and found incredibly useful from a practical professional standpoint is a book called Booklife, all one word, written by Jeff Vandermeer, science fiction author and also editor of a number of very interesting anthologies. And this is really an absolutely excellent guide to not necessarily writing your work, although he does talk about aspects of writing that are very important, like the discipline of writing and all that. And he talks a little bit about craft. But Booklife, for me, was really an eye-opener into how to market my writing, use social media to promote my writing, find potentially agents and look into publishing my writing. It's a wonderful nuts and bolts for the backside.
Yeah, all those things that surround the act of writing itself. So I was just wondering, you mentioned, how important receiving criticism is and criticizing other people's work, not necessarily negatively, but just constructively. And you've obviously had a lot of opportunity to have your work analyzed and get feedback from it. How do you deal with, negative feedback or perhaps hard feedback? And how do you know when you are getting good feedback?
It's an excellent question. I think some of it is just a learned skill. And it's one of the reasons I really say, if it is at all possible to find a critique group to work with, find one. Because it's such an incredibly important tool to grow as a writer. But it's not always easy to get the feedback. Even now, my first response sometimes, even sitting with some of my most trusted readers, who are telling me something about a work I don't necessarily want to hear, is to push back, right? And say, well, but maybe you just don't understand this, maybe you didn't see this. And I really have to fight that impulse when it arrives, because I think the best thing you can do when you're maybe hearing that hard criticism that may not be cruel, may be very constructive, but is difficult to hear about something you've worked so hard on. I think the most important thing you can do for yourself is take the time you need to process what you've heard before you respond to it. I have often found that after some time to just think, I will often come around to that person's point of view or see the way in which that criticism helped me. And other times, I think you do have to trust your instincts. At the end of the day, it is true that no one understands what you're trying to do as well as you do. Now, if 7 people out of a group of 8 are telling you they didn't understand why, Mr. X went to, Mrs. Z's house,
there's probably a problem.
You might want to revisit that paragraph. But for the most part, if you really, after that processing time, still have an incredibly negative reaction to a potential change, trust yourself. It just may not be right for your work.
Now, one final question before I let you go. I want to be respectful of your time. When you've just hit a wall, where do you find the motivation to keep going?
I think the motivation for me is the next day. I really, on the worst day, I'm like, why am I in this job? Everybody has those days. And I just remind myself, this is how you feel today. But it isn't how you felt yesterday. It isn't how you felt last week. And it's probably not the way you're going to feel tomorrow. That's when I go back to that piece of advice that's just right. Just keep going. Even if you have to take a break from that project, or even just that place in that project, and work on something else, find a way to keep words coming, and you'll get through it.
Yeah, every day is a new day. Well, that's a very hopeful note to end on. Thank you so much for letting me speak with you and for your time.
Absolutely.
I appreciate it.
Thank you for your time.
Do you have any...
Thanks for having me.
No problem. Do you have a place where people can find you online, or perhaps a Twitter handle or anything like that people can hit you up on?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm on Facebook, author page under Rebecca Adams Wright. And you can also find me at my website, which is just radamswright.com.
Perfect. And of course, people can find your book, The Thing About Great White Sharks, and other short stories from Amazon, which I've actually in the middle of reading. I'm thoroughly enjoying it and hoping to finish it later on.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, no, I think it's fantastic. And I think a lot of our listeners and our readers will appreciate it because it's right up the alley of writing prompts and kind of what we do at the Writing Prompts subreddit.
Fantastic. Yeah, thanks for the time. So glad to talk to you and to your listeners.
So there you have it, Rebecca Adams Wright. How cool is she? Make sure to check her out on her website, hit her up on Facebook, send her a little message if you want to hear more from her. Make sure to check out her book, The Thing About Great White Sharks and Other Stories. It is super awesome. You can get it on Amazon. It's there digitally, or you can get it in print. If you liked the interview and you enjoy this kind of thing, let us know. You can go to Twitter at Prompted Podcast, follow us, tweet at us, let us know what your thoughts are. Or you can, of course, go to our subreddit, prompted.reddit.com. I'd love to do more of these. I had a lot of fun, so if we could do more of these interviews kind of interspersed with our regular episodes where we read the stories from Writing Prompts, that would be super cool, but I don't know. I mean, if you hated it, we can just go back to regular episodes, but I feel like you probably enjoyed it, and, we're even maybe a little inspired, because I know I was. Prompted is brought to you by myself, Hunter Christensen. I will see you in a couple weeks where we'll have another regular episode once again. In the meantime, stay creative.